I'm Dr. Stephanie Hayes, clinical psychologist at Algoma Family Services. We're here to talk about how to support the mental health needs of children, adolescents, young adults, and adults. Through a series of short videos, as well as accompanying learning guides that include additional resources, we'll talk about how to support the mental health needs of others, especially when we're in any kind of a caregiving or helping role. So that could be as a parent, as a foster parent, as a respite worker, as a therapist, really anytime we're interacting with someone else that may have a need for some extra support related to mental health. The first thing I would like to talk about is mental health and neurodiversity. This is actually a subject often overlooked, where the mental health needs of people who may have differently functioning brains, such as people with autism spectrum disorder or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or intellectual disabilities, are often overlooked in the mental health world. And historically, called diagnostic overshadowing, was that someone who had one of these diagnoses wasn't eligible to have another diagnosis like anxiety. So for example, autism is often linked with anxiety. And in the previous world, we weren't even able to kind of diagnose the two together. And that has actually led to a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about how we support those diverse mental health needs with people who have diverse other needs. And so often we think that the strategies, supports, therapies we use with someone with a more neurotypical brain don't work for someone with a neurodiverse brain. And what we're actually learning is that that's not the case. And so we can have autism and anxiety. We can have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and depression. And in fact, it's actually more of the rule than the exception. So how do we shift our focus in order to provide more supports to people with various learning, intellectual, cognitive functioning, social skills needs, other deficits? So how do we kind of bridge that gap? And that's what we'll be talking about today. Something important to remember when we're talking about neurodiversity is that no people are alike. So just like snowflakes, no two people presenting with even the same condition, say autism, FASD, intellectual disability, no two people are the same. We have a wide variety of skills across a whole range of domains. So there's a ton of strengths as well as deficits. And so really getting to know someone, getting to really understand how they think, how they see the world, what supports they might need is a really important first place to start from. So getting to know the individual and that individual snowflake, seeing them for what they are, is extremely important. Now, the purpose of this video isn't to go into depth about neurodiversity and what all the differences are. I actually invite you to take a look at the learning guide. There are links to a couple of videos that really explain, what is autism, what is FASD, and give you some more depth there. But what I'd like to talk about is just to highlight those primary deficit areas that can occur and again are highly variable per every individual. So it could include things like difficulties learning, getting a concept or generalizing it, which means applying it across settings. So you may learn a skill one place, one way, but can't then translate it somewhere else. There's a lot of consistencies sometimes. So that means like being able to tie your shoes one day, maybe not being able to tie your shoes the next day. So we can kind of have these differences and deficits that are quite variable. Includes a lot of attention issues or difficulties planning ahead, difficulties reading body language or social cues. Unfortunately, a lot of the challenges that come along with being neurodiverse contribute to other mental health problems. Can also make them longer lasting and permeate the family. So the families can also experience mental health associated with the neurodiversity of their child or loved one. So that can be increased stress, that can be increased burden of care, that could be, having to take care of the social deficits. So sometimes stepping in or helping them navigate the world, access services, things like that. But when we're talking about the primary disabilities, so the main things like the deficits in social skills and learning and those extra areas of support, those can also contribute to mental health. They can also lead to what we call secondary disabilities. So often people who already are vulnerable because of their neurodiversity can be just as vulnerable to other experiences in the world. So for example, experience more adverse childhood experiences. So that's more developmental trauma. So more things can happen to someone who's vulnerable. In a recent study looking at FASD clinic in Alberta, they actually found that the average adverse childhood experience score was significantly higher for the kids presenting for an FASD assessment. We also see increased rates of vulnerability in autism and other intellectual disabilities. So kids can be more naive, more susceptible. There's a lot more abuse, unfortunately, and so we do need to take steps in order to not only maintain a trauma-informed lens, understanding that there may be other experiences that maybe they haven't been able to share with us because of difficulties in communication or experiencing. So we always have to remember that, as well as trying to protect them and boost some of their other skills in order to manage mental health symptoms. So things like bullying is another issue that really can contribute to difficulties in mental health. Researchers, including those in Ontario, have been identifying higher rates of mental health disorders in children and adolescents with co-occurring neurodiverse issues. So whether it's autism, FASD, or intellectual disabilities, these are quite significant differences compared to kids without neurodiverse issues. So some estimates have actually said that kids with FASD in particular, up to 94% have mental health issues. I've seen some studies that suggest up to 70% of children and adolescents with autism, or even adults with autism, experience mental health issues, and some suggest that it's actually quite a bit more. So we know there are greater mental health needs, and that historically we haven't been addressing those needs. And we see that in difficulties being reported by people with disabilities in their ability to access supports and services, and their ability to use and get their needs met in lots of different ways. So they often say that professionals, don't know how to respond to them, don't know how to care for them, and just don't ask them what they need. So there's a couple of important things here, I think, when it comes to supporting mental health needs with kids and adults with neurodiverse issues, and that's including them, that's asking them, that's really contributing to their sense of belonging. So to really engage them in the process, whether that's as a parent or as a support worker, respite, foster parent, any role that you're in is to really get to know them as an individual snowflake, to figure out what their strengths are, what their needs are, and how we can support them. Because we know how to address mental health needs in those with typical development, we also know how to address those needs in folks with atypical development. And that is really the same approaches, but we just need to take more time in order to break it down and to modify and accommodate where needed. So that is to capitalize on strengths, to make sure communication is clear, that we use lots of different visuals and other supports, and that we build really collaborative teams in order to support that, to kind of figure out what the communication is. So it's not a behavior, but it's a communication, and then how to meet that unmet need. So there's a lot of variety. There's various ways to do that. And it really depends, again, on the unique individual. So I want to say that all our different strategies that we do, in research for folks who are typically developing do apply. We just need to maybe shift it a little bit. And we can take some great lessons from education. So inclusive education has worked towards this universal design for learning in order to break down and make information more accessible. And we can take a lot of those tips also from education. So we can use visual supports, we can include videos, we can build in routines and practice and really reinforce and generalize those skills. So make sure that we are learning it again and again as needed. So shifting our lens away from behavior, so thinking that it's that they won't do something, to thinking that they can't do something, can be very helpful. Also applying that trauma-informed lens, which we'll discuss further in another video, but really considering where people are coming from, and that it could be a mental health need that is unmet, and we could put in some strategies and supports in order to do that. And we have a lot of people we can go to build those kinds of strategies and supports. I will also include some further resources in the learning guide for you to take a look at. And I do encourage you especially to take a look at the videos about autism as well as FASD. And I hope that that may shift some of your understanding. Any discussion about mental health in kids and youth and adults with neurodiversity, I don't think is complete without discussing the mental health of those who support them. So it's always important to remember self-care and to access as much support as you can, because there's a ton of strain when it comes to caregiving sometimes, as well as a ton of joy. And so being able to reflect on that, as well as being able to connect with others who may be experiencing similar things to you, I think is really important. Whether you're a respite worker or caregiver, grandparent, any kind of helping role, building communities of practice where we can grow our understanding of the individuals we support, I think is a very important kind of next step. And there are resources available. Again, take a look at the learning guides. In a further video, we'll talk more about self-care. But as I always say, people eye roll when I say self-care, but it really is important. And it's not just to take time out to do something simple, but it's so that you are as calm and available to help coach the people who rely on us when they're in crisis and in distress, which can be really difficult because we care about them, and seeing them in distress can increase our distress. And so that's where self-care really comes into play too, and trying to support our own mental health as best we can. Wellness has so many different factors to it. So it's important to really, bolster any areas we can, because the larger buffer we have of wellness, then the more ready we are to face when those bumps come. Because unfortunately, they will come again. We are all faced with different kinds of challenges, and it's how we meet them and how we're resilient and how we come back from them and how we model that resiliency to those that we're supporting, those that we love, those that we care for. I think that has some of the largest ramifications, right? Is really modeling that kinds of support. So mental health is very important. It is extremely important for those with neurodiverse needs, because they do experience more mental health distress than those, typical developing brains, and are more susceptible to other vulnerabilities like developmental trauma, so those adverse childhood experiences. And so it's important that we pump up the positives as much as we can and capitalize on strengths and work together in order to really bridge that research to practice, so we can get the mental health skills to those who need them, because we know that we can do that our therapy and our supports and our services work. We just need to modify or accommodate in order to meet the individual needs. So we need to really make them as specific as possible. And sometimes that takes a lot of tracking in order to figure out what that behavior is. And other times it may come a little more naturally. But if you find a strategy that works, share it amongst the collaborative team so that other peoples can implement it also in other areas. All right. So thank you very much for your time. And I hope that you find the rest of these videos helpful.